River Rouge, Dearborn, Michigan, October 1941. The smell hit Frank Kozlowski before he even stepped through the door. Hot metal cut in oil and that particular acrid bite of arc welders firing in sequence. Toledo's Willys-Overland Plant hummed with the desperate energy of a company that had just won the contract of its life. 16,000 Jeeps, the biggest order in the company's history. And Frank could already see the problem. He stood at the edge of the assembly area, 45 years old, hands clasped behind his back in a posture that 27 years couldn't erase. Once a sergeant, always a sergeant, even in civilian clothes, even with a Ford Motor Company badge clipped to his jacket pocket. The younger engineers from Dearborn clustered around the Willys production line, clipboards out, sketching notes about the MB model they'd soon be building under license. Frank just watched. 4 men at a single workstation, each one hunched over what Willys called a radiator grill. 13 individual bars of flat steel stock, each one cut to length, each one positioned by hand. Each one welded into place with meticulous precision. The lead welder, a man about Frank's age with forearms like bridge cables, moved with practiced efficiency. But efficiency had its limits. Frank pulled the stopwatch from his vest pocket. Click. The welder positioned the first vertical slat against the frame, tack weld, repositioned, full weld. The blue-white flash illuminated tired faces. 12 more slats to go. 43 minutes later, Frank clicked the stopwatch again. 43 minutes, he muttered, writing the number in the small notebook he always carried. 4 men, 1 grill. The Ford engineer nearest him, a kid fresh from Michigan Tech named Patterson, glanced over. Something wrong, Frank? You do the math, son. 16,000 Jeeps. 43 minutes per grill. 4 men per station. Frank's pencil scratched across paper. You're looking at about 1,100,000 man-hours just for grills, and that's if everything goes perfect, which it won't. Patterson frowned at his own notes. Willys is managing 16,000 Jeeps, Frank interrupted quietly. We're not building 16,000 Jeeps. The younger man blinked. Sir, the contract specifically says, I was in France in 18, Patterson. I know what a buildup looks like. Frank nodded toward the windows where the October afternoon sun slanted through industrial haze. Right now, somewhere across the Atlantic, some Germans building tanks. Lots of them. And when Washington figures that out, when they stop pretending this European war isn't our problem, they're not going to want 16,000 of these little trucks. He let the words hang in the air. Watching the welding station, the second grill had begun. Same 4 men. Same 43 minutes ahead of them. They're going to want 100,000, maybe more. Patterson's pen stopped moving. Frank had seen this before. Not Jeeps, not in Detroit, but the pattern was identical. In 1917, when he'd been a young buck sergeant helping prepare troops for France, he'd watched the Army try to equip divisions with hand-fitted rifles. Beautiful weapons, precision craftsmanship, and completely inadequate for the scale of industrial war. The Germans had learned that lesson at Verdun. The British at the Somme. America learned it late, as usual, and paid for the education in blood. The Rouge Plant, where Frank worked, where he'd worked for 19 years since coming home from France with a Purple Heart and a pronounced limp, had taught him a different gospel, Henry Ford's gospel. Mass production, interchangeable parts, assembly lines that turned craftsmanship into mathematics, art into engineering, slow into fast. He'd started as a line worker, stamping fenders. Within 5 years, he was a supervisor. Within 10, he was the man other supervisors called when a production process was broken. Frank didn't have engineering degrees. He had something better. He understood the difference between what looked good on paper and what worked when you needed 10,000 of something by Thursday. And this welded grill, it looked beautiful. Each one a small monument to skilled metalwork, but it wouldn't scale, couldn't scale. A room full of men to make a grill, Frank said, closing his notebook. That's what I'm seeing here. The Willys production manager, a harried-looking man named Coleman, had noticed the Ford contingent and was making his way over. He had the perpetual squint of someone working 18-hour days, which he probably was. Winning the Army contract had been Willys-Overland's salvation. The company had barely survived the Depression. Now they had a lifeline if they could deliver. "Gentleman from Ford," Coleman said, extending a hand, getting a good look at the MB. "Fine machine," Patterson said diplomatically. "The Go Devil engine is impressive." 60 horsepower, Coleman said with unmistakable pride. "That's what won us the contract, power and price. We came in at $748.75 per unit. Ford bid $782. Frank shook the man's hand but said nothing. He'd seen the bid documents, knew the numbers. Ford had bid higher and quoted a longer delivery time, 171 days against Willys' 149. On paper, Willys had won fair and square, but Frank had also seen the fine print that Willys apparently hadn't considered. The contract included a clause about designating a second manufacturer if required by military necessity. Required by military necessity. Frank knew government speak when he heard it. That clause wasn't there by accident. Someone in Washington was already thinking about scale, about what happened when, not if, America entered the war. "Your welding setup here, eh?" Frank said, nodding toward the grill station. "How many stations you running?" 8, Coleman said. "We're adding 4 more next week, and each one produces about 12 grills per shift, assuming no issues. We're working 2 shifts now, planning to go to 3 after Thanksgiving." Frank did the math in his head. 12 grills per station per shift. 8 stations, soon to be 12. 3 shifts. On a perfect day, no breaks, no defects, no delays, they might hit 400 grills. Realistically, maybe 300. 16,000 Jeeps meant 16,000 grills. At 300 per day, that was 53 days of production just for grills. And that assumed everything else in the Jeep assembly kept pace, which it wouldn't because grills would be the bottleneck. Unless Willys added more welding stations, more workers, more space, more training time, more everything. "What's your rejection rate?" Frank asked. Coleman hesitated. "We're working on that. The boys are still learning the process. Maybe 10% right now, but it'll come down." 10%? Frank's face remained neutral, but his notebook opened again. 300 grills per day, minus 30 rejects. 270 usable grills per day, 59 days of production, and that was for 16,000 Jeeps. The tour continued. Frank saw the chassis assembly line, the engine installation, the final inspection stations. Everything was well organized, efficient by peacetime standards. Willys had won the contract for good reasons. But Frank kept coming back to those 4 men at the welding station, the blue-white flash of the arc welder, the 43 minutes ticking away. On the train ride back to Dearborn that evening, Patterson sat across from Frank in the dining car, picking at a plate of meat loaf. "You think we'll get a second contract?" the young engineer asked. Frank looked out the window at the darkening Ohio countryside rushing past, farmland, small towns, church steeples catching the last light. America at peace for a few more weeks, maybe a few more months if they were lucky. "Son, I think we're going to get a lot more than a second contract," Frank said quietly. "I think we're about to build more Jeeps than anybody at Willys can imagine. But the bid, forget the bid. This isn't about who bid lowest. This is about who can deliver when Washington realizes they need 500,000 of these things." Patterson nearly choked on his coffee. 500,000, Frank, that's impossible with that welded grill, Frank finished. "Yeah, I know." He pulled out his notebook again, flipping to the sketch he'd made of the Willys grill. 13 individual bars, each one hand-positioned, each one welded. Beautiful, precise, completely wrong for mass production. Ford didn't hand-weld fenders. Ford stamped them, 1 press, 1 die, 1 chunk of sheet metal transformed into a perfect fender. In seconds. Cha-chunk, done. Why not a grill? The idea was so obvious that Frank almost dismissed it. Too simple, too crude. The Willys grill had a certain elegance. Those individual slats gave it character, made it look purposeful and strong. A stamped grill would just be a whole punch piece of sheet metal, ugly really, like someone had taken a ticket punch to a steel plate. But ugly didn't matter. Fast mattered. Cheap mattered. Scalable mattered. Frank's pencil moved across the page. 9 vertical slots. Why 9? Because 9 felt about right for airflow, and 9 was an odd number that wouldn't create a centered bar that might block vision. Simple rectangular cutouts, no curves, no complexity. Just a flat piece of steel with 9 holes punched through it. 1 press, 1 die, 1 second. Cha-chunk. Patterson was watching him sketch. What's that? Nothing, Frank said, closing the notebook. Just thinking. But it wasn't nothing. It was everything, and Frank knew it. When he got home that night, a modest house in Dearborn, walking distance from the Rouge, his wife Margaret was waiting up. She'd been a nurse in France during the war, which was where they met. She understood the look on his face. "You saw something today?" she said, not a question. "I saw a problem," Frank replied, hanging his coat on the rack by the door, "and maybe a solution." "Is it going to mean long hours at the plant?" Frank thought about those 4 welders in Toledo, thought about Patterson's disbelief at the number 500,000, thought about the German tanks rolling through Poland and France, and about America's inevitable entry into the war, and about 16,000 Jeeps that wouldn't be nearly enough. "Yeah," he said, "probably long hours." Margaret just nodded. She'd been through one war already. She knew what was coming as well as he did. That night, after Margaret had gone to bed, Frank sat at the kitchen table with his notebook open and a pencil in his hand. The house was quiet except for the old regulator clock on the wall, tick, 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 measuring out seconds that suddenly felt precious. He sketched the grille again, 9 slots, simple, ugly. Then he wrote beneath it, "Stamping time, est, 5 to 8 seconds. No welding, no assembly, no skilled labor required." And below that, 43 minutes to 8 seconds. Production increase, 300x, 300 times faster. That was the difference between a welded grille and a stamped one. That was the difference between craft and mass production. That was the difference between peacetime thinking and wartime reality. Frank looked at his sketch for a long time. It was ugly, no question. The welded Willys grill had personality. You could see the craftsmanship in every bar. This stamped version looked like exactly what it was. A piece of metal with holes in it, but ugly had its own beauty in wartime. Ugly meant fast. Ugly meant cheap. Ugly meant you could build enough of them. He dated the sketch October 18th, 1941. 50 days before Pearl Harbor, 50 days before the world changed and the ugly truth became the only truth that mattered. River Rouge, Dearborn, Michigan, November 1941. The engineering department at Ford's River Rouge complex occupied the 3rd floor of the administration building, a space that smelled of blueprint chemicals and cigarette smoke in equal measure. Frank Kozlowski didn't belong there. He was a line supervisor, a factory floor man, someone who dealt with production reality rather than theoretical designs. But on the morning of November 4th, he climbed those stairs anyway, his sketch folded in his jacket pocket. He found Bob Gregory in his office, surrounded by drafting tables and technical drawings. Gregory was Ford's chief stylist, the man who designed the Continental and a dozen other vehicles. He was also one of the few senior people who'd listened to ideas from the factory floor, which was why Frank had picked him. "Frank," Gregory said, looking up from a set of drawings, "what brings you up to the ivory tower?" "Got something to show you. About the Jeep contract." Gregory's expression shifted. The Jeep program was sensitive. Ford had lost the primary contract to Willys, but was being kept warm as a potential second source. Everyone knew the government was hedging its bets, but officially, Ford was just building a few units for evaluation. Frank unfolded his sketch and laid it on the drafting table. Gregory stared at it for a long moment. "That's a grill?" "That's a stamped grill. Single piece of sheet steel. 9 vertical slots, 1 die, 1 press, 8 seconds start to finish." "It looks like a jail cell." "It looks fast," Frank countered. "The Willys grill takes 43 minutes to weld." 43 minutes, Bob. "We can't build scale production on 43-minute grills." Gregory picked up the sketch, studying it with the critical eye of a man who'd spent his career making vehicles beautiful. "Frank, this is, well, it's ugly. It's brutally functional, but it has no character. The Willys grill has those individual slats. You can see the craftsmanship." "You can see the bottleneck," Frank said. "Look, I'm not trying to win a beauty contest. I'm trying to figure out how Ford builds Jeeps when, not if, Washington needs 100,000 of them." 100,000? Gregory set down the sketch. "Frank, the contract is for 16,000 right now. But I was in the last war, Bob. I know what mobilization looks like, and when it comes, when the shooting starts and the calling up begins, They're not going to want pretty grills. They're going to want Jeeps, lots of them, fast. Gregory was quiet for a moment, his finger tracing the 9 slots on Frank's drawing. You really think stamping could work? The strength requirements? Same gauge steel as the frame. One piece means it's actually stronger than welded bars. No weak points at the joints. And we already have stamping capacity. We stamp body panels all day long. This is just a panel with holes in it. The Army's not going to like it. They approved the Willys design, specifically. The Army's going to like getting their Jeeps on time. That's what they'll like. Gregory studied Frank for a moment. You know what you're really proposing here? You're proposing that Ford tell Willys, the company that won the contract, that their grille design is wrong. I'm proposing that Ford tell Willys their grille design doesn't scale. There's a difference. Not to Willys, there isn't. Frank had expected this resistance. It was about more than engineering. It was about corporate pride, about contracts and patents and the delicate dance of wartime manufacturing. But he'd also done his math, and the numbers didn't care about corporate feelings. Bob, help me out here. Get this in front of someone who can make it happen, because if we wait until after Pearl Harbor... Gregory's head snapped up. After what? Frank caught himself. He didn't have secret intelligence. He wasn't privy to classified briefings, but he read the newspapers. He saw the embargo on Japan, the frozen assets, the diplomatic breakdowns. He knew how these things ended. After we're in the war, he corrected. When we're in the war. It's coming, Bob. You know it is. Gregory looked at the sketch again, then at Frank. Let me talk to Sheldrick. He's running the Jeep program, but Frank, temper your expectations. This is pretty radical. Radical's welding grills by hand during wartime. This is just practical. But as Frank walked back down to the factory floor, he knew Gregory was right. The sketch was radical. It threw away the entire aesthetic philosophy of the Willys design in favor of pure functionality. It was the difference between a craftsman and a factory, between individual and industrial, between peacetime and war. And right now, America was still at peace. 3 days later, Frank was called to a meeting in the engineering conference room. Sheldrick was there, Lawrence Sheldrick, Ford's chief engineer. So was Gregory Patterson from the Toledo trip and 2 other engineers Frank didn't recognize. The sketch was on the conference table, now rendered as a proper technical drawing. Mr. Kozlowski, Sheldrick said formally. He was a precise man with wire-rimmed glasses and a reputation for brilliant engineering. Bob tells me this is your concept. Yes, sir. Based on what I saw at the Willys plant. Your assessment is that the current grill design is a production bottleneck. It's not an assessment, sir, it's math. 43 minutes per grill with a 10% rejection rate means Willys can produce maybe 300 usable grills per day at full capacity. That's fine for 16,000 Jeeps. It doesn't work for what's coming. One of the engineers. Frank didn't know. A younger man with oil-stained hands that marked him as a prototype builder spoke up. We could just add more welding stations, scale up the Willys design. You could, Frank agreed, but you'd need to scale up the workforce, too. Train more welders, which takes time. Add more floor space, buy more welding equipment, and you'd still have that 43-minute cycle time. My way, you use capacity we already have. Stamping presses, Sheldrick said. Yes, sir. We stamp thousands of body panels a day. This is just another panel. Simpler, actually. No curves, no compound surfaces, just flat steel with rectangular cutouts. Sheldrick picked up the technical drawing. It's certainly straightforward, but there's the question of military approval. The Army specified the Willys design. They've tested it extensively. They tested it for function, not for production speed, now Frank said. This grill does the same job. Protects the radiator, provides airflow, mounts the headlights. It just does it 300 times faster. 300 times. The prototype builder sounded skeptical. 43 minutes versus 8 seconds. That's a 322x improvement, actually. I rounded down. Sheldrick set down the drawing and looked at Frank over his glasses. You understand what you're proposing is going to ruffle feathers. Willys won the contract based partly on their design. If Ford shows up with a completely different grill... Ford shows up with a faster production method, Frank interrupted, then caught himself. Sorry, sir. But that's all this is. It's not about whose design is better. It's about whose design can deliver when the war starts. The room went quiet. No one wanted to say it out loud, but everyone was thinking it. The Japanese were massing forces in the Pacific. The Germans had conquered most of Europe. The Soviets were fighting for survival, and America was still technically neutral, still debating, still one incident away from being pulled into the maelstrom. Sheldrick looked at the other engineers. Some kind of silent communication passed between them, the language of men who'd worked together long enough to read each other's thoughts. "Build me a prototype," Sheldrick said finally. "One grille stamped according to this design. If it works, if it fits the Jeep frame, provides adequate cooling, and passes basic strength test, then we'll talk about taking it to the Army." Frank felt something unknot in his chest. "Yes, sir. When do you need it?" "Yesterday, preferably, but I'll settle for next week." As the meeting broke up, Gregory pulled Frank aside. "You know they're going to call it the Ford Grille if this works," he said quietly. "Willys is going to be furious." "Let them be furious," Frank said, "as long as Jeeps get built." "And if it doesn't work? If the stamped version fails strength tests or doesn't cool properly?" Frank thought about the 4 welders in Toledo, about the 43 minutes he'd measured, about the mathematics of mass production that had been Ford's gospel since the Model T. "It'll work," he said. "Ugly works." The prototype took 4 days. Frank worked with the die makers, translating his rough sketch into precise specifications. 9 slots, each one, 3.5 inches wide and 11 inches tall, evenly spaced across a flat steel panel, mounting holes for the headlight brackets, bolt holes for attachment to the frame. Simple, brutal, effective. The die was cut, tested, adjusted. On November 12th, they ran the first piece. The stamping press was a beast, a 50-ton mechanical monster that could shape steel like clay. Frank stood next to the operator, a woman named Ruth, who'd been stamping fenders for 3 years. She fed the blank sheet of steel into the press, positioned it, and triggered the ram. Chunk. The press came down with the sound of controlled thunder. When it lifted, a finished grille sat in the die. 9 perfect slots, clean edges, no welding, no assembly, just formed steel. Ruth pulled it out and handed it to Frank. It was still warm from the pressure. 8 seconds, she said, checking her timer, including load and unload time. Frank turned the grill over in his hands. It was ugly, no question. Compared to the elegant welded slats of the Willys design, this looked crude, stamped, manufactured, industrial. But it was also strong. He tested the edges, the mounting points, solid and fast, so incredibly fast. "Run me 5 more, he said. Ruth stamped 5 more grills in 40 seconds. What took Willys 43 minutes, Ruth did in less than a minute for 6 grills. By the end of the day, they'd produced 100 test grills. Frank selected the 6 best ones and took them to the engineering lab for testing. The strength test came back positive. The stamped grill was actually 12% stronger than the welded version because there were no weak points at the weld joints. It was also 8% lighter, which meant better fuel economy. Not much, but enough to matter over hundreds of thousands of vehicles. The fit test came next. They mounted a stamped grill onto a test Jeep frame, one of the evaluation vehicles Ford had built based on Willys' specifications. The grill bolted up perfectly, the headlight brackets aligned. The cooling airflow, measured with careful instrumentation, was within 3% of the welded version. On November 20th, Frank delivered his report to Sheldrick. "It works," he said simply, laying test results and photographs on the engineer's desk. "Stronger, lighter, faster, 322 times faster." Sheldrick studied the data with the careful attention of a man who knew his recommendation would carry weight. "The question now is whether the Army will accept it. Their testing was based on the Willys design. They tested for function. This is functionally identical, actually superior in strength and weight. The only difference is aesthetic. Aesthetic matters to some people, Frank. Not in a war, it doesn't." Sheldrick smiled slightly. "Let's hope you're right. Because I'm going to recommend we present this to the Quartermaster Corps as an improved production method, and I'm going to recommend that if Ford receives a contract to build Jeeps, we build them. With your grill." Frank felt the weight of it then, what he'd started with a simple sketch at a kitchen table. This wasn't just about a grille anymore. It was about how Ford would contribute to the war effort, about whether American industrial might would be shackled to peacetime thinking or unleashed with wartime pragmatism. One more thing, Sheldrick added. If this does go forward, Willys will need to adopt the design too. For interchangeability, that's going to be a conversation. Will they fight it? Wouldn't you? They won the contract. They designed the vehicle. Now Ford comes along and says, your grille is fine, but ours is better. Ours is faster, Frank corrected. Better is subjective. Faster is math. 2 weeks later, on December 7th, 1941, Frank was home with Margaret listening to the radio while she worked on a crossword puzzle. The Sunday afternoon program was interrupted by an announcer's voice, tight with something between shock and rage. We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by air. President Roosevelt has just announced. Margaret's pencil stopped moving. Frank sat very still, his hands on his knees, listening to the details pour out of the radio. Battleships burning, aircraft destroyed, thousands dead. The announcer's voice kept saying surprise attack, as if surprise mattered anymore. It started, Margaret said quietly. Yeah. Frank's mind was already racing through production numbers, capacity calculations, the mathematics of mobilization. It started. The next morning, Frank was at the Rouge before sunrise. He wasn't the only one. The parking lot was already half full with workers who'd heard the news and knew what it meant. War production, full mobilization, everything they had, everything they could build, everything they could produce. Patterson found him on the factory floor. Frank, meeting in 30 minutes, Sheldrick's office. They want you there. The meeting was crowded. Every senior engineer, every production manager, several people Frank recognized from Edsel Ford's executive staff. Sheldrick stood at the head of the table, looking like he'd been up all night. He probably had been. Gentlemen, Sheldrick said without preamble, the government called at 600 this morning. They're activating the second source clause in the Jeep contract. Ford is being asked to prepare for immediate production of the Willys-Overland design, with one significant change. He pulled out Frank's technical drawing of the stamped grille and pinned it to the wall. They want this grille. They want it because it's faster, and because Willys has agreed, as of 2 hours ago, to adopt the same stamping process. As of now, the welded grille is obsolete. Both manufacturers will use the Ford stamped design. Frank felt the room's attention shift to him. The Army's asking for initial production of 63,000 units from Ford, with more to follow. They're also asking for a delivery timeline that assumes the stamped grille's production speed. Mr. Kozlowski, your ugly design just became the standard. Someone in the back of the room, Frank couldn't see who, laughed, not mockingly, with relief. The kind of laugh that comes when you realize you're not going to have to do something the hard way. When do we start? Frank asked. Die production begins today. First stamped grilles for installation by January. We're being asked to decentralize production, not just here at the Rouge, but at Louisville, Dallas, Chester, Richmond, Edgewater. 6 plants total. The government wants Jeeps coming from both coast and the middle of the country in case of enemy action against our manufacturing centers. Enemy action against American factories. The war had come home before the first American soldier even shipped out. How many? Patterson asked. Total. How many Jeeps do they think we'll need? Sheldrick looked at the assembled men. They don't know yet. Hundreds of thousands, certainly, maybe more. This isn't like the last war, gentlemen. This is industrial warfare on a global scale, and we're going to need every second of production speed we can get. Frank thought about his sketch, about the ugly 9-slot design that had seemed so obvious to him in Toledo, about Ruth's 42nd production run of 6 grilles, about the mathematics of war, 322 times faster than welding. It still wouldn't be fast enough, not for what was coming, but it would have to be. One more thing, Sheldrick said. The government is classifying the production methods as essential to the war effort. That means both Ford and Willys will share the stamping design. No patent battles, no corporate rivalry, just production. Willys agreed to that? Someone asked. Willys was given a choice, Sheldrick said dryly. Adopt Ford's grille design or lose their contract to a manufacturer who could deliver faster. They adopted it. First stamped grills from Toledo will roll out in March. March. 4 months away. The welded grill would die slowly. Each of the 25,808 units already built a testament to beautiful craftsmanship that war had rendered obsolete. Frank felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. Pride that his design would be used. Sadness for those 4 welders in Toledo whose skilled work had just become unnecessary. War did that, made the beautiful obsolete and elevated the ugly to necessity. As the meeting broke up and people scattered to their new wartime assignments, Gregory caught Frank in the hallway. "You called it," Gregory said. "You knew this was coming." "I didn't know Pearl Harbor," Frank said. "I just knew something. Some kind of attack that would bring us in, didn't know where or when. But you prepared anyway, your ugly grill." Frank looked out the window at the Rouge complex. Acres of buildings, miles of assembly lines, thousands of workers already shifting into wartime. Rhythm, within months, this place would be producing Jeeps by the thousands. By spring, hundreds of thousands. And every single one would have 9 simple slots stamped into its face. Ugly, brutal, fast. In war, Frank said quietly, pretty gets people killed, ugly gets them home. Gregory was quiet for a moment. "They're going to want you to oversee the rollout, train the other plants, make sure everyone's stamping these grills correctly." I figured. That's going to mean travel, lots of it. Louisville, Dallas, out to California. Frank thought about Margaret, about the quiet house in Dearborn, about the kitchen table where this had all started. But he also thought about the boys. Some of them would be his neighbors' sons, maybe his friends' kids, who'd be driving these Jeeps into combat. They deserved vehicles that worked. They deserved production speed that meant there'd be enough Jeeps to go around. They deserved ugly. "When do I leave?" Frank asked. "Louisville, day after tomorrow. We need to get their die production started." Frank nodded. "I'll be ready." That evening, he told Margaret about the assignment. She listened while making dinner, her hands steady as she peeled potatoes, her face showing no surprise. "How long?" she asked. "Don't know. Months, probably. Maybe longer." "And this grill of yours, it's really that important?" Frank thought about Ruth's 8-second production time. About 43 minutes reduced to 8 seconds. About 322 times faster, multiplied by hundreds of thousands of Jeeps, multiplied by every theater of war where those Jeeps would go. "Yeah," he said, "it's really that important." Margaret set down her knife and looked at him, really looked at him the way she'd looked at wounded soldiers in France when she was assessing how bad things really were. "Then you'd better go," she said simply. "And you'd better make sure every one of those grills is perfect." "They won't be perfect. They'll just be ugly." "Frank," she touched his hand, "sometimes ugly is perfect." He thought about that later, lying awake in bed while Margaret slept beside him. Thought about the welded grills with their individual craftsmanship, their aesthetic appeal, their 43-minute pride. Beautiful, impractical, wrong for the moment. And he thought about his stamped grills, 9 rectangular slots. Crude, industrial. Right. The war would be won with ugly things. Ugly tactics, ugly sacrifices, ugly truths. His grill was just the beginning, just one small piece of the massive, brutal machinery that would have to be built to win this thing. But it was his piece, his ugly contribution. 8 seconds. Cha-chunk. The sound of victory being stamped into steel. River Rouge, Dearborn, Michigan, January 6, 1942. The first production Ford GPW rolled off the line at 47 hours on a Tuesday morning. Frank Kozlowski was there to see it, standing next to the final inspection station with a clipboard and his ever-present stopwatch. The Jeep was olive drab, functional, and bore the stamped grill that had consumed his last 2 months. 9 slots, simple, ugly, perfect. The inspector, a meticulous man named Horvath, who'd been with Ford since the Model T days, walked around the vehicle, checking tolerances, testing components. When he got to the grill, he ran his fingers along the stamped edges, feeling for burrs or stress fractures. "Clean," Horvath said. "Good stamp. Edges are smooth." Frank made a note on his clipboard. The grill had come from Ruth's press 7 in Building B, and had taken exactly 8 seconds to produce, just as his calculations had predicted. But this wasn't about vindication. This was about whether the damn thing would hold up. Mount integrity? Frank asked. Horvath tugged on the grill, testing the bolt connections. Solid. Maybe even better than the... He caught himself, glanced at Frank. Better than the previous design. Everyone was being careful not to criticize the Willys welded grill directly. Politics, corporate diplomacy, the kind of thing that Frank had no patience for, but understood was necessary. Willys had agreed to adopt the stamped design, but the wound to their pride was still fresh. Temperature check, Frank prompted. They fired up the Jeep's Go Devil engine and let it run for 20 minutes while monitoring radiator temperature. The stamped grill allowed proper air flow, actually slightly better than the welded version due to the increased opening area. When Horvath shut down the engine and checked the readings, he nodded. Within spec, actually running 2 degrees cooler than the test standard. Frank signed off on the inspection sheet. Tag it for the Army evaluators. They'll want to see the first production unit. As Horvath drove the Jeep to the holding area, Sheldrick appeared at Frank's elbow. The chief engineer looked exhausted. They all did. The last month had been a blur of 18-hour days, rushed tooling, accelerated production schedules. War didn't wait for anyone to catch their breath. Congratulations, Sheldrick said. Your grill works. Our grill, Frank corrected. I just sketched it. Your engineers made it real. Modest, that's new for you. Sheldrick pulled out a cigarette. Lit it. How many did we produce yesterday? Frank consulted his clipboard. Grills, 473 from the 6 presses we have running. Would have been more, but press 3 went down for maintenance in the afternoon. 473. Sheldrick did the math in his head. 43 minutes per grill on the old design would have given us, what, maybe 30 grills per day? 28, accounting for shift changes and breaks. So we're producing roughly 17 times more grills than the welded method would have allowed. 17 times more than Willys could produce in Toledo, Frank clarified. But we're not competing with Willys anymore. We're supplementing them. Both of us against the Germans and Japanese. Sheldrick took a long drag on his cigarette. Speaking of which, you leave for Louisville tomorrow? Yeah. They're having trouble with their die setup. Grills are coming out with rough edges. Can they fix it? They'd better. Louisville's supposed to be producing 500 grills a day by February. And Dallas? Dallas is on track. Their dies are good. Richmond's having spacing issues. The slots are coming out slightly too narrow. Chester's fine. Edgewater... Frank paused. Edgewater's a mess. Define mess. Their dies are cutting wrong. Something about the steel they're sourcing. Grills are warping under stress. Sheldrick closed his eyes briefly. So out of 6 plants, we have 1 perfect, 1 good, 2 with fixable problems, and 1 disaster. That's about right. And you're supposed to fix all of them. That's what line supervisors do, Frank said. We fix problems. You're not a line supervisor anymore, Frank. As of this morning, you're officially a production consultant. War Materiel Division. Congratulations on the promotion. Frank looked at Sheldrick. Does it come with a raise? No, it comes with a train ticket to Louisville and the authority to make decisions without waiting for approval from Dearborn. Use it wisely. The train to Louisville left that evening. Frank sat in a coach car. First class was for executives, and he wasn't that, promotion or not, watching the winter landscape of Ohio roll past in the darkness. Other passengers were reading newspapers, the headlines screaming about Japanese advances in the Pacific, German victories in North Africa, the grim arithmetic of war. Frank thought about grills. 473 yesterday, maybe 500 today. By the end of the month, if he could get all 6 plants running properly, they might hit 3,000 grills per day. That was over 90,000 per month. By spring, maybe twice that. And Willys, adopting the stamp design, would add their own production numbers. Ugly was scaling up. Louisville's plant was smaller than the Rouge, but had its own character. Built in the 1920s, upgraded in the 30s, now humming with wartime urgency. The plant manager, a Kentucky man named Cassidy with a thick drawl and shrewd eyes, met Frank at the entrance. You're the grill man, Cassidy said, shaking hands. Heard you designed the stamped version. Heard you're having problems with it. Cassidy grimaced. Come see for yourself. The stamping area was loud, 3 presses running simultaneously, each one slamming down with that distinctive chi-o chunk that Frank had come to associate with progress. But when Cassidy held up one of the finished grills, Frank saw the problem immediately. The edges were rough, almost serrated. Not enough to fail inspection, but enough to be a quality issue. Worse, they'd cause problems during assembly. Those rough edges would catch on mounting hardware, slow down the installation process. Frank examined the die. Who set this up? Thompson. He's our best die maker. Where is he? Thompson turned out to be a rail-thin man in his 50s, with oil under his fingernails and a defensive expression. Followed the specs exactly, he said before Frank could even ask. Everything's to tolerance. The edges say otherwise. Frank ran his finger along a finished grill. What's your press speed? 8 seconds, same as the Rouge. Show me. They ran a piece. Thompson loaded the blank, positioned it, triggered the ram, Che chunk. 8 seconds later, a grill with rough edges. Frank watched the press carefully during the cycle. There, just as the die came down, there was a slight wobble, barely visible, but enough to cause the steel to shear unevenly. Your press is out of alignment, Frank said, just slightly, maybe half a degree, but at 50 tons of pressure, half a degree matters. Thompson's defensive expression cracked. How can you tell? Because I've been watching Ruth stamp grills for 2 months and her press doesn't wobble. It took 3 days to realign the press. Frank worked alongside Thompson and Cassidy's maintenance crew using levels and precision instruments to adjust the massive machine back to true. They tested, adjusted, tested again. Finally, on the 3rd day, they ran a test piece. Che chunk, perfect edges, clean cuts, no burrs. Thompson held the grill up to the light, examining it from every angle. I'll be damned, he said quietly. Don't be, Frank replied. Just be precise. Every press and every plant needs to be this precise, or we're producing junk. How'd you learn to diagnose that so fast? Frank thought about the Rouge, about 19 years of watching metal being shaped, about understanding that machines had personalities, quirks, tails. Experience, he said simply. And Ruth. Who's Ruth? The best stamping press operator I know. She taught me to listen to the machine. That wobble you had? She would have heard it immediately. Cassidy, who'd been watching the whole process, spoke up. You know we're supposed to hit 500 grills a day by February. I know. That's 2 weeks away. Then we better get the other 2 presses aligned. They worked around the clock. Frank stayed in a boarding house near the plant, sleeping 4 hours a night, spending the rest of his time in the stamping area. He taught Thompson and the other die makers how to listen for the press's song, how to spot the tiny misalignments that cause quality issues. By January 20th, Louisville was producing 450 grills per day with less than 1% rejection rate. Frank caught a train to Dallas. Dallas was hot even in January, and the Ford plant there smelled of oil and optimism. The plant manager, a transplanted Texan named Morrison, was younger than Cassidy and clearly felt he had something to prove. Our grills are perfect, Morrison said, showing Frank the daily production reports. 520 yesterday, 543 the day before. We're exceeding quota. Frank picked up a finished grill from the inspection station. Morrison was right. The stamping was excellent. Clean edges, proper spacing, good tolerances. He checked 3 more. All perfect. You're doing good work, Frank said. Morrison visibly relaxed. Glad to hear it. Wasn't sure what to expect from Dearborn sending an inspector. I'm not an inspector. I'm a troubleshooter. And you don't have trouble, so I won't be here long. Music to my ears. Where to next? Richmond. They've got spacing problems. Rather you than me. Heard that plant manager's a real son of a bitch. Frank smiled slightly. I've worked for Henry Ford. I can handle difficult. Richmond's plant sat on the California coast, close enough to the Pacific that you could smell salt in the air. The plant manager, Morrison had been right about him, was a man named Kellerman who seemed to take personal offense at Frank's arrival. My plant doesn't need Dearborn second-guessing us, Kellerman said coldly. We're producing grills. With slots that are 3/16 of an inch too narrow, Frank replied, holding up a technical drawing. That's going to cause cooling problems. Our inspectors passed them. Your inspectors are wrong. That did not improve Kellerman's mood. But Frank didn't need Kellerman's approval. He needed the dies fixed. He found the die maker, a quiet Portuguese man named Silva, and explained the problem. Silva listened, examined the dies with the jeweler's precision, and nodded. "I can fix this," Silva said. 3 days, maybe 4. "Do it," Frank said. "But Mr. Kellerman, I have authority from Dearborn, War Materiel Division. You fix the dies. I'll handle Kellerman." Silva smiled for the first time. "You're going to be popular around here." Frank wasn't there to be popular. He was there to make sure every Jeep that rolled off these lines had a grille that worked. Soldiers would be driving these vehicles into combat. They deserved equipment that didn't fail because some plant manager's pride got in the way of proper tolerances. By the time he left Richmond 3 weeks later, Silva had corrected the dies, and the plant was producing grills with proper spacing. Kellerman still hated him, but the grills were right. That was what mattered. Chester, Pennsylvania was next. The plant there was running smoothly. Good dies, experienced workers, production ahead of schedule. Frank spent 2 days confirming everything was working properly, then moved on, which left Edgewater. Edgewater, New Jersey, was Ford's problem child. The plant was old, the equipment was temperamental, and the steel they were sourcing was, as Frank discovered within an hour of arriving, completely wrong for stamping grills. "It's warping," the plant manager, harried man named Kowalski, said, showing Frank a stack of rejected grills. "We stamped them perfect, and then within an hour they start to warp. Look." He was right. The grills were bending slightly along the vertical axis, enough to make them unusable. Frank examined the steel specifications. "Where's this steel coming from?" "Local supplier. They're cheap." "They're cheap because they're using inferior alloy. This isn't the spec steel. But the paperwork says one thing, reality says another. You need to switch suppliers." "That'll take weeks." "The procurement process will be expedited by me calling Dearborn and having them classify this as essential war material. Which supplier does the Rouge use?" Kowalski looked through his files. "Midland Steel." "Then get Midland Steel today." It took more than a day. It took 4 days of paperwork, 3 long-distance calls to Dearborn, and 1 very pointed conversation with a procurement officer who didn't understand why steel specifications mattered so much. But by February 10th, Edgewater was receiving proper steel from Midland. The warping stopped. Frank stayed an extra week watching the presses run with the new steel, confirming that quality was holding. By the time he left, Edgewater was producing 400 grills per day and climbing. On the train back to Dearborn, Frank calculated the numbers. Rouge, 500 grills, day Louisville. 450 grills, day Dallas. 540 grills, day Chester. 420 grills, day Richmond. 380 grills, day Edgewater. 400 grills, day total 2,690 grills per day from Ford plants. That was over 80,000 grills per month, 80,000 Jeeps. And those were just Ford's numbers. Willys was ramping up their own stamped grill production in Toledo. Frank thought about those 4 welders he'd watched back in October, wondered if they were still there or if they'd been reassigned to other war work. 43 minutes per grill seemed like ancient history now, like something from a different era before Pearl Harbor, before the world changed. Cheek, chunk, 8 seconds. Next. That was the sound of modern war. Not the crack of rifles or the thunder of artillery, the rhythmic, relentless stamping of industrial production. Steel being shaped into victory, 1 ugly grill at a time. When Frank got back to the Rouge in early March, the plant had been transformed. More presses running, more shifts added, more workers, including increasing numbers of women as men shipped out for military service. Ruth was training new operators, teaching them the 8-second rhythm, showing them how to listen for problems. "Look who's back," Ruth said when she saw Frank, the traveling man. "The plants are running," Frank said, "all 6 of them. I heard you made some enemies, too. Made some grills. That's what matters." Ruth fed another blank into her press, chunk. "You know what I heard on the radio yesterday? General Marshall talking about Jeeps. Called them America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. Made me think, that's our grills he's talking about. Every Jeep he saw had our 9-slot design." "Your 8-second production time," Frank corrected. "Our ugly design," Ruth said, smiling. "Hey, Frank, You ever worry that people are going to forget who actually made all this happen? Frank thought about that. Thought about his name not appearing in any official reports, about how the stamped grill was just called the Ford grill or the standard grill now, with no attribution to the ex-sergeant who'd sketched it at a kitchen table. No, he said honestly, I don't worry about that. Why not? Because somewhere in North Africa or the Pacific or wherever these Jeeps end up, some kid's going to be driving one, and that grill is going to protect his radiator, keep his engine cool, get him where he needs to go. He's not going to know who designed it. He's not going to care. He's just going to be grateful it works. Ruth was quiet for a moment, then nodded. That's a good answer. It's the only answer that matters. That evening, Frank met with Sheldrick to review the production reports from all 6 plants. Excellent work, Sheldrick said, studying the numbers. We're actually ahead of schedule. The Army's increasing the order, another 63,000 units. We can handle it. I know you can. But there's something else. Sheldrick pulled out a letter on Army letterhead. The Quartermaster Corps wants to formally recognize the stamped grill design. They're writing it into the standardized specifications for all military Jeeps, both Ford and Willys production, and they want to know who to credit. Frank felt something uncomfortable in his chest. Credit? For the design. They want a name for their records. Put down Ford Motor Company. Frank, I'm serious. This wasn't me. This was Ford's production philosophy. Ruth's 8-second timing. Your engineers making the dies work. Thompson in Louisville fixing that press alignment. Silva and Richmond correcting the spacing. It was all of us. Sheldrick studied him. You know most men would jump at the chance to have their name in an official Army report. Most men aren't ex-sergeants who learned in France that the guys who talk about their medals usually didn't earn them. That's surprisingly philosophical. That's practical. Frank tapped the production report. These numbers matter. My name doesn't. In the end, the official Army specification simply read, radiator grill, stamped steel, 9-slot design, standard for all manufacturers. No attribution, no credit, just the technical description of how to make it. Frank was fine with that. By the end of March, Ford's 6 plants were collectively producing over 3,000 grills per day. Willys, having fully transitioned to stamped production in Toledo, was adding another 1,500. That was 4,500 grills daily. 135,000 per month, over 1 million per year if production held steady. And it wouldn't hold steady, it would increase. More plants coming online, more shifts added, more capacity being built, the mathematics of industrial war multiplying day by day. Frank stood in the Rouge's stamping area one evening after the day shift had ended, watching the night crew take over. Ruth's replacement, a young woman from Ohio named Betty, was running press 7 now, feeding blanks with the same 8-second rhythm Ruth had pioneered. Cheer, chunk. The press came down, the die cut clean, another grill joined the stack. Betty pulled it out, checked the edges by feel, loaded the next blank. Chunk. Ugly. Simple. Fast. Perfect. Frank thought about those welded grills in Toledo, about the craftsmanship that had gone into each one. Beautiful work. Careful work. Obsolete work. This was the future, not individual artistry, but collective production. Not slow perfection, but fast adequacy. Not beautiful, but functional. War had no use for beauty. War needed ugly things that worked. His grill was the ugliest thing he'd ever designed. It was also the best. Somewhere out there, loading onto transport ships, being driven off assembly lines, heading toward distant theaters of war, Jeeps with 9-slot grills were beginning their journeys. Some would end up in North Africa, bouncing across desert sand, and some would hit the beaches of Pacific Islands. Some would slog through European mud, and every single one would have a grill that took 8 seconds to make instead of 43 minutes, 322 times faster. The difference between adequate and inadequate, between enough and not enough, between winning and losing. Frank pulled out his pocket watch, the same one he'd used to time those welders in Toledo back in October. 5 months ago, an eternity ago, a different world ago. Chunk. Betty stamped another grill. 8 seconds, perfect edges. Frank checked his watch and smiled, right on time. Toledo, Ohio, March 1942. Frank Kozlowski had never expected to return to Willys-Overland. The company that had won the original Jeep contract wasn't likely to welcome the man whose ugly design had replaced their carefully crafted grille. But on a cold morning in early March, Frank found himself walking through the same factory gates he'd passed through 5 months earlier, when the world had been at peace and 43-minute grills had seemed acceptable. Now nothing was acceptable except speed. The plant manager who met him wasn't Coleman, the harried man from October, had apparently been promoted to a coordination role in Washington. Instead, Frank shook hands with a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s named Catherine Morse, who studied him with an expression somewhere between resignation and curiosity. "Mr. Kozlowski," she said, her voice carrying the flat vowels of northern Ohio, "I understand you're here to oversee our transition to the stamped grille." "To assist with the transition," Frank corrected. "This is your plant. I'm just here to share what we learned at Ford." Morse's expression suggested she knew exactly what he was, a consultant forced on them by government contract, a reminder that Willys hadn't been fast enough with their own design. But she was also pragmatic enough to know that resentment didn't win wars. "Walk with me," she said. The factory floor was louder than Frank remembered, more crowded, more urgent. Where there had been space and careful organization in October, now there was barely controlled chaos. Production lines running at capacity, workers at every station, the constant motion of materials and components flowing toward the assembly areas. But it was the welding stations that caught Frank's attention. There were 12 of them now, up from the original 8, each one with its team of 4 welders, each team producing grills with the same meticulous care Frank had observed months ago. The blue-white flash of arc welders lit the area like artificial lightning, and the smell of hot metal hung thick in the air. "We're producing about 400 grills per day," Morse said, following his gaze. "We added capacity, hired more welders. We've gotten the cycle time down to 38 minutes, 5 minutes faster than October." Frank did the math. That was still 76 times slower than stamping, an improvement that was utterly insufficient for wartime needs. "When do the presses arrive?" he asked. "Next week. 4 stamping presses, dies already manufactured to Ford specifications. We're supposed to be producing stamped grills by April." "That's aggressive. That's what the government told us. Aggressive or lose the contract." Morse's voice was carefully neutral, but Frank heard the edge beneath it. "Our welders have been doing this for months. They're good at it. They're proud of their work. And now we're telling them their jobs are being eliminated." Frank had known this moment was coming, had thought about it during the train ride from Detroit. The human cost of industrial efficiency was always paid by the humans being made efficient. "What's happening to them?" he asked. The welders." "Reassignment. We've got plenty of other work. Body panels, chassis assembly, engine installation. Nobody's losing their job. They're just losing their craft." They stopped at one of the welding stations. The lead welder, the same man with bridge cable forearms that Frank had observed in October, was positioning the 8th slat on a grill frame. His movements were precise, economical, practiced, the kind of motion that came from thousands of repetitions, from muscle memory built over months. The welder glanced up, saw Morse and Frank watching, and nodded acknowledgement before returning to his work. The arc welder flashed, another slat secured, 5 more to go. "Key." "That's Jim Kowalski," Morse said quietly. "Been with us since we got the contract. He can build a grill in 35 minutes now. 3 minutes faster than anyone else. Best welder I've got." "Where's he going after the transition?" "Chassis welding. It's important work. But it's not his work, if you understand the difference." Frank understood. He'd seen it before in the shift from craftsman production to assembly line manufacturing. The loss wasn't just about the job. It was about identity, about the pride that came from building something complete, something you could point to and say, "I made that." "Can I talk to him?" Frank asked. Morse looked surprised. "Why?" "Because he deserves to hear it from the person who designed what's replacing him." Morse studied Frank for a long moment, then nodded. "His break is in 20 minutes. I'll arrange it." They met in the break room, a utilitarian space with long tables, coffee that tasted like motor oil, and windows that looked out onto the parking lot. Jim Kowalski sat across from Frank, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, his expression guarded. "Mrs. Moore says you designed the new grill," Kowalski said. "I sketched it. Engineers made it work." 8 seconds, I heard, instead of 43 minutes. Instead of 35 minutes in your case. I watched you in October. You're fast. Kowalski's jaw tightened slightly. Not fast enough, apparently. Frank had prepared several speeches on the train, explanations about production capacity, wartime necessity, the mathematics of industrial mobilization. But sitting across from this man, watching the careful control in his expression, the speeches felt inadequate. "No," Frank said simply. "Not fast enough for what's coming. None of us are fast enough for what's coming. That's why we had to change." "Your design is ugly." "Yes. The welded grill looks better. Stronger, more purposeful." "Also, yes." Kowalski seemed thrown by Frank's agreement. "So why replace it?" "Because beautiful gets soldiers killed when there aren't enough Jeeps to go around. Because we need hundreds of thousands of these vehicles, and we need them now. And 35 minutes per grill, even your impressive 35 minutes, won't get us there in time. You think the war's going to be that big?" Frank thought about Pearl Harbor, about the German army deep in Russia, about Japanese forces across the Pacific, about the sheer scale of industrial warfare in the modern age. "Yeah," he said, "I think it's going to be that big." Kowalski was quiet for a moment, staring into his coffee. "I was good at this. Building grills. I had it down to a rhythm. Knew exactly how much pressure for each weld, exactly where to position each slat. I could feel when a grill was right. And now that skill doesn't matter. Now that skill's obsolete." Kowalski looked up. "You know what that feels like?" "I was an infantry sergeant in France in 1918, Frank said. "I was good at trench warfare. Knew how to read terrain, how to organize defensive positions, how to keep men alive in static combat. Then the war ended, and all those skills were obsolete. The next war isn't going to be fought in trenches. It's going to, be mobile, mechanized, fast. Everything I learned doesn't matter anymore." "So what did you do?" "Found new skills, learned production instead of warfare, studied how to make things instead of how to destroy them." Frank gestured toward the factory floor beyond the break room windows. "Your welding skill isn't obsolete, Jim. Just your welding application. The chassis still needs welders. So do tanks, ships, aircraft. You got skills this war needs, just not for grills anymore." Kowalski nodded slowly, but Frank could see the loss in his eyes, the knowledge that something he'd been proud of, something he'd perfected, was being set aside for pure efficiency. "The boys overseas," Kowalski said finally. "The ones who'll be driving these Jeeps, they won't know the difference, will they? Between a welded grill and a stamped one. No, they'll just see 9 slots that protect their radiator. But we'll know. The guys who made them will know." "Yeah," Frank agreed. "We'll know." They sat in silence for a moment, 2 men on different sides of industrial progress, both understanding the necessity and hating it a little. "When do we stop?" Kowalski asked. "And welding grills." "March 6th, last shift. After that, all production switches to stamped." "March 6th. Kowalski considered that. 3 days. 3 days. "You going to be here for the last one?" Frank hadn't planned on it. He'd intended to oversee the press installation, train the new operators, and return to Detroit. But looking at Kowalski's face, he understood what was being asked. Someone should witness the end. Someone should acknowledge what was being lost, even as progress demanded the loss. "Yeah," Frank said. "I'll be here." The next 3 days were a blur of activity. The stamping presses arrived on massive flatbed trucks, each one a 50-ton monument to industrial efficiency. Frank worked with Willys' engineers and die makers, translating the lessons learned from Ford's 6 plants into Toledo's specific requirements. The plant's maintenance chief, a barrel-chested man named Sullivan, had concerns about the factory floor supporting the press weight. They reinforced the foundations, working through the night. By March 5th, all 4 presses were installed, aligned, and tested. The first Toledo stamped grill came off the press at 8:30 on March 5th. Chew chunk. Frank stood next to the operator, a young man freshly trained, nervous about his first production run, and watched the die come down. When it lifted, a perfect 9-slot grill sat in the press bed. Clean edges, proper spacing, Textbook production. 8 seconds, the operator said, checking his timer with evident relief. Good work, Frank said. Now do it 4,000 more times today. By mid-afternoon, the 4 presses were running in concert, stamping grills in steady rhythm. Chait-chunk, chait-chunk, chait-chunk. The sound of progress, of efficiency, of ugly necessity winning over beautiful craft. But on the other side of the factory floor, the welding stations were still running. Jim Kowalski and his fellow welders were building their final grills, each one a small monument to the old way, the way that had won Willys the contract, the way that had seemed sufficient before Pearl Harbor. Catherine Morse found Frank near the end of the day shift. Tomorrow's the 6th, she said, last day of welded production. Some of the welders want to make something special, last grill off the line. Would that be acceptable? Special how? Kowalski wants to sign it, all 12 welders, their names on the back panel, something for the company archives. Frank thought about that, about 12 names on a piece of steel, a memorial to a production method being retired. It violated every principle of standardized manufacturing. No grill was supposed to be unique or special. They were all supposed to be identical, interchangeable, anonymous. But this last one wouldn't go on a Jeep, wouldn't ship overseas. It would just be a reminder that before the stamping presses, before the 8-second production time, there had been craftsmen who cared about their work. Do it, Frank said. March 6th, 1942, dawned gray and cold. Frank arrived at the plant before first shift, found the welding stations already active. Kowalski and his team were there early, determined to build as many grills as possible before the deadline. The last welded grill was scheduled for 1,600 hours, end of the second shift. After that, the welding stations would go dark, and all production would shift to the stamping presses. Frank watched the day unfold with a strange mix of emotions. Pride in what the stamped grills represented, efficiency, scale, the industrial might that would help win the war. But also a kind of melancholy for what was ending, the careful craft, the individual attention, the 43 minutes, now 35 minutes, of focused human skill. By 15:30, the welding stations had gone quiet, except for Kowalski's. He was building the final grill, taking his time now, no longer racing against production quotas. The other welders had gathered around, watching their lead craftsman complete the last one. Frank stood at the edge of the group, witness to an ending. Kowalski positioned each slat with deliberate care. The arc welder flashed, securing the metal with precision born from hundreds of repetitions. 13 slats, each one placed exactly right. When he finished the last weld, he stepped back and examined the grill in silence. 32 minutes, someone said, checking the clock. Fastest one yet, Jim. Kowalski pulled off his welding helmet and wiped his forehead. His face was streaked with sweat and burn marks, the marks of a craftsman. He turned the grill over and began engraving his name on the back panel with a small metal stylus. Jim Kowalski, March 6, 1942. Last welded grill. The other 11 welders added their names, one by one. When they finished, Morse stepped forward and accepted the grill, holding it carefully. This will go in the company museum, she said, so people remember how we started. Before the ugly grills took over, someone muttered, not hostile, just sad. Frank almost let it pass, but then he thought about the soldiers who'd be driving these Jeeps, about the mechanics who'd be maintaining them under fire, about the arithmetic of war that demanded speed over beauty. Ugly grills, that work, Frank said quietly. That's all that matters now. Kowalski met his eyes. You really believe that? That ugly's better? I believe ugly's necessary. Better's what we can't afford anymore. The welding stations were shut down that evening, the equipment powered off, the tools packed away. The welders reported to their new assignments, chassis work, body panels, engine components. Important work? Necessary work. But not their work, not the thing they'd perfected. Meanwhile, the stamping presses ran through the night. Che-chunk, che-chunk. By midnight, Toledo's 4 presses had produced over 1,500 grills. In 32 minutes, Kowalski's fastest welding time, the presses produced 4 grills. In his slowest time of 43 minutes, they produced 6. The math was brutal and undeniable. Frank stayed through the night shift, watching the operators find their rhythm, troubleshooting the minor issues that always arose with new equipment, a press that needed alignment, adjustment, a die that was cutting slightly off spec, problems that could be fixed, problems that wouldn't stop production. By morning, Toledo had produced 3,200 stamped grills. It would have taken Jim Kowalski and his 11 welders nearly 3 weeks to produce that many by hand. Frank walked through the now quiet welding area as dawn light crept through the factory windows. The station stood empty, waiting for reassignment to other production needs. Someone had left a single welded grill hanging on the wall, not the signed one, just a standard and production grill from earlier in the week. 13 carefully welded slats, clean welds, purposeful design, beautiful in its own industrial way. Frank stood there for a long time looking at it. "Saying goodbye?" Catherine Morse's voice came from behind him. "Acknowledging what we're replacing," Frank said. "Occur? There's a difference." "Is there?" Morse moved to stand beside him, studying the welded grill. "We built 25,808 of these, November 1941 to yesterday. Each one took human skill, human judgment, human pride. Now we're building grills that take none of those things, just a machine and 8 seconds. We're building enough grills," Frank corrected. "That's what matters." "You keep saying that. What matters?" "As if you've decided what matters and what doesn't." "The war decided. I'm just responding to it." Morse was quiet for a moment. "You know what the welders are calling your grills, the ones we're stamping now?" "I can imagine." "They're calling them the surrender, because Willie surrendered our design to Ford's production method. It wasn't Ford's production method. It was just faster production. Willys had thought of it first. We'd be adopting your design. But you did think of it first, and now every Jeep, Ford or Willys, has your 9 slots instead of our 13 bars." Morse turned to face him. "You understand what you took from us? It wasn't just a production method. It was identity. Willys built the grill that won the Army contract. Now Willys builds a cheap copy of a Ford design." Frank felt the weight of that, the corporate pride wounded, the craftsman displaced, the careful work rendered obsolete. But he also felt the weight of the other thing, the soldiers who needed Jeeps, who needed them now, who needed enough of them to win. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it. "I'm sorry that progress looks like this, that war demands this, but I'm not sorry we made the change." Morse's expression softened slightly. "You're not going to apologize for being right." "I'm not right. I'm just faster. Right would be finding a way to keep the craftsmanship and gain the speed, but war doesn't give us that option." "No," Morse agreed. "It doesn't." They stood together in the empty welding area, 2 people on different sides of the same necessity, both understanding what had been lost and both accepting that the loss was unavoidable. "The presses are running well," Morse said finally. "Your troubleshooting last night fixed most of the issues. There'll be more issues, there always are, but your team knows what to watch for now." "So you're leaving?" "Tomorrow. Back to Detroit, unless you need me to stay longer." "No." Morse looked at the welded grill on the wall one more time. "I think we know how to stamp ugly grills now." Frank smiled slightly at the barb, but there was no real malice in it, just acknowledgement of reality. That evening, Frank found Jim Kowalski in the parking lot loading tools into his truck. The chassis welding assignment would require different equipment, different techniques, another transition. "Heading out?" Frank asked. "Yeah. New schedule starts Monday, different shift, different station." Kowalski closed his truck bed. "Saw the presses running all night. They don't stop, do they?" "Not unless something breaks." "And if something breaks?" "We fix it and start again. That's production." Kowalski nodded slowly. "You know what's strange? I'm angry about all this, about my grills being obsolete, but I'm also, I don't know, impressed. Those presses produce more in an hour than I could in a week. It's brutal, but it's also kind of amazing." "That's the paradox of progress," Frank said. "It makes us obsolete and impresses us at the same time. You ever worry that you're making yourself obsolete? That someday there'll be a faster way to do what you do?" Frank thought about that, about the day when production would be so automated that men like him, troubleshooters, Efficiency experts, human problem solvers, would no longer be needed. Yeah, he admitted, I worry about that, but not during wartime. During wartime, we need every advantage we can get. And after the war, we'll figure out what peace looks like, whether there's room for craftsmanship or whether everything will be stamped and efficient and ugly. Kowalski extended his hand. Good luck, Frank. I hope your ugly grills win the war. Frank shook his hand. They won't win it alone, but they'll help. He watched Kowalski drive away, then walk back into the factory. One last time. The stamping presses were still running, the night shift in full production. Cha-chunk, cha-chunk, the relentless rhythm of industrial warfare. Catherine Morse was in her office reviewing production reports by lamplight. She looked up when Frank knocked on the door frame. Couldn't sleep, she asked, wanted to check final numbers for the day. She handed him the report. 4,100 stamped grills. First full day of production. No welded grills for the first time since November. 4,100. Frank thought about what that number represented, about the fact that it would have taken nearly 3 months of welded production to reach that total, about the soldiers who'd have those Jeeps weeks or months earlier because of stamping, about the 12 welders whose names were inscribed on a grill that would never see combat. It's done then, Frank said. The conversion, Morse agreed, though I prefer to think of it as the surrender. You can call it whatever you want, as long as the grills keep coming. Oh, they'll keep coming. We're already ahead of our quota for March. By April, we'll be producing over 6,000 per day. She paused. Your ugly grills are very efficient, Mr. Kozlowski. They're not my grills anymore. They're everyone's grills. Yours, mine, Ford's, the Army's. They belong to whoever needs them. Morse studied him in the lamplight. You really don't care about credit, do you? About being remembered as the designer? Frank thought about his name not appearing in any official documents, about the stamped grill being a nameless, faceless piece of military specification, about history remembering the Jeep but forgetting the men who made it possible. I care about one thing, he said. Those grills working when some kid in North Africa or the Pacific needs his Jeep to start. That's all that matters. That's all that matters, Morse repeated softly. You say that a lot, because it's true. He left Toledo the next morning, taking the train back to Detroit through a landscape that was rapidly transforming. More factories, more production, more urgency. America was mobilizing, and the stamped grill was just one small part of that massive effort. But as the train rolled east, Frank thought about the last welded grill, about 12 names inscribed on steel, about the end of one era and the beginning of another. Beautiful and ugly, craft and efficiency, pride and necessity. War didn't care which one you preferred. War only cared what worked, and ugly worked. Normandy, France, June 6, 1944. Private First Class Danny Torres had never seen the ocean before joining the Army. Now crouched in a Higgins boat approaching Omaha Beach with 60 pounds of equipment and a rifle he'd fired exactly once in combat. He was seeing more ocean than he'd ever wanted. The beach ahead was chaos incarnate, explosions, tracer fire, the bodies of men who'd landed minutes earlier floating in the surf. Torres's landing craft jerked violently as something, artillery or waves he couldn't tell, slammed into its side. Men vomited, men prayed. Men who'd been joking about French girls an hour ago now stared at nothing, faces gray with terror. The ramp dropped. Go, go, go! Torres ran because everyone else was running. He hit water up to his chest, struggled forward, watched the man beside him spin and fall without a sound. The beach was a nightmare of sand and steel and screaming. He threw himself behind a destroyed landing craft, gasping, trying to remember his training through the overwhelming noise. That's when he saw the Jeep. It had come off an earlier wave, somehow made it past the obstacles and mines and murderous German fire. Its driver was slumped over the wheel, clearly dead. But the Jeep itself was intact, engine still running, and Torres recognized it as something real, something American, something that didn't belong in this hell. He crawled toward it, expecting any second to feel the impact that had dropped the man beside him in the water. But somehow he reached the Jeep, pulled the dead driver out with shaking hands, climbed behind the wheel. The grill was right in front of him, 9 vertical slots, stamped steel, dented by shrapnel, but still intact. Behind those slots, the radiator was punctured and leaking, but the Go Devil engine was still chugging. Torres didn't think. He threw the Jeep in gear and drove up the beach toward the seawall, where men were pinned down by German machine gun fire. He picked up 3 wounded soldiers, threw them in the back, drove them to the medic station that was somehow, impossibly, functioning behind a destroyed pillbox. Then he went back for more. 5 trips across that beach, each time expecting to die, each time watching that grille with its 9 simple slots, thinking about whoever had designed something so ugly, so functional, so perfectly American. By nightfall, Torres had evacuated 14 wounded men. The Jeep's radiator was shot, its windshield was gone, 2 tires were shredded, but it still ran. That grille, dented and scarred, still protected what was left of the cooling system. Someone from a newsreel crew filmed Torres climbing out of the Jeep, covered in other men's blood, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold a canteen. The footage would run in theaters. Back home, 30 seconds of a dirty kid from New Mexico standing next to a shot-up Jeep with 9 slots visible in the frame. Torres never learned who designed that grille, but for the rest of his life, whenever he saw those 9 slots on civilian Jeeps in parking lots, in magazine advertisements, in parades, he thought about Omaha Beach and the ugly piece of stamped steel that had somehow kept that engine cool enough to save 14 lives. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands, August 1942. Sergeant Michael Chen had grown up in San Francisco's Chinatown, the son of immigrants who'd never fully trusted the government that now had him fighting in the Pacific. The irony wasn't lost on him. Asian American fighting Asian enemies for a country that had interned Japanese Americans just months earlier. But Chen had volunteered anyway because the enemy at America's gates wasn't nuanced politics. It was an empire that had bombed Pearl Harbor and would bomb San Francisco next if given the chance. Now he was in the jungle, heat so oppressive it felt solid, humidity that rotted everything, and Japanese soldiers who fought with a ferocity that terrified even hardened Marines. Chen's unit had been on Guadalcanal for 3 weeks, and he'd already seen more death than his mind could process. The Jeeps were lifelines. They brought ammunition, evacuated wounded, carried supplies through terrain that would have broken larger vehicles. Chen's Jeep, he thought of it as his, though technically it belonged to the Marine Corps, had that distinctive 9-slot grille that every American vehicle seemed to have now. "Hey, Chen," his driver, a Louisiana kid named Dubois, said one day while they were waiting for a supply convoy. "You ever wonder why all the Jeeps got the same grille?" "Mass production," Chen said, cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time that day. "You cleaned constantly in the jungle. Everything rusted, everything rotted, everything died." "Yeah, but why this design? Why 9 slots? Why not 8 or 10? Chen looked at the grille. He'd never really thought about it before. It was just there. Part of the Jeep's face, as distinctive as the flat hood and the exposed headlights. "Maybe 9 is lucky," Chen said. "Lucky?" Dubois laughed. "Nothing's lucky about this place." But the Jeeps kept running, through mud that would swallow a truck, through rivers that would stall a half-track, through Japanese ambushes and American incompetence and the general chaos of jungle warfare. The Go Devil engines overheated constantly in the tropical heat, but those grilles kept enough air flowing to prevent complete failure. Chen's Jeep took a hit during a supply run 3 days later. Japanese machine gun fire stitched across the hood, punching holes through the metal, shattering the windshield, killing Dubois instantly. Chen felt something slam into his shoulder, but kept driving, one-handed, blood soaking his uniform. He looked at the grille through the haze of pain and shock. 2 of the 9 slots were partially blocked by twisted metal from the bullet impacts, but 7 were still clear. The radiator was hit, but not destroyed. The engine temperature was climbing, but not critical. Chen made it back to base, delivered his supplies, and passed out from blood loss while trying to report to his CO. When he woke up in the field hospital, the first thing he asked about was Dubois. Dead. The second thing he asked about was the Jeep. "Still running," the medic said. "Motor pool, patched the radiator, hammered out the grille, put it back in service." The grille, Chen's pain-fogged mind tried to make sense of that. "They fixed it?" "Nah, just straightened it. That stamped steel's tough, bends, but doesn't break. Better than the old welded ones, apparently. Those would have shattered from that kind of impact. Chen lay back, processing that. 9 slots, stamped steel, tough enough to take machine gun fire and keep working. Ugly enough that nobody cared what it looked like, only that it functioned. He never knew who designed it. But later, when he came home with a Purple Heart and memories he'd spent decades trying to forget, he'd see those 9 slots everywhere, on civilian Jeeps and advertisements, on toys his kids would play with, and he'd remember Dubois and the jungle and the ugly grille that had somehow kept him alive long enough to get help. North Africa, Tunisia, February 1943. Captain Elizabeth Morrison wasn't supposed to be within 100 miles of combat. Army nurses were support personnel, supposed to stay safely behind the lines while men did the fighting. But in North Africa, there were no lines, just desert, Germans, and Americans trying to figure out how to fight a modern war against an enemy that had been doing it for years. Morrison's field hospital was a collection of tents 5 miles behind what was theoretically the front. In practice, German patrols and air raids meant nowhere was safe. She'd lost count of how many times they'd packed up the entire hospital and moved it in the middle of the night, racing ahead of enemy advances or regrouping after Allied retreats. The Jeeps made it possible, small enough to maneuver through the desert, tough enough to handle the terrain, fast enough to evacuate wounded before they died from shock and bleeding. Morrison had learned to drive one out of necessity. When casualties were heavy, everyone who could drive became a driver. She was bringing back medical supplies from a depot when she saw the patrol. 6 German soldiers clearly separated from their unit, armed and looking for targets of opportunity. Morrison was alone, driving a Jeep marked with red crosses that the Germans might respect if they were inclined toward mercy, or might not. She floored the accelerator. The Jeep's Go Devil engine whined as it hit maximum speed, not fast, but faster than walking Germans could manage. They fired anyway. Morrison heard bullets hitting the Jeep, felt the vehicle shudder, but kept driving. She couldn't risk looking back, couldn't risk anything except keeping the Jeep moving. One of the soldiers had better aim than the others. A round hit the radiator dead center, and Morrison saw steam start to billow from beneath the hood. Not good. In the desert, an overheated engine meant death. You couldn't walk far enough to reach help before the sun killed you. But the grill, that ugly stamped grill with its 9 slots, was still intact. Damaged, yes, one of the slots was partially blocked by a bullet lodged in the metal, but 8 slots were still open, still channeling air to the wounded radiator. Morrison drove for 20 minutes on a radiator that should have failed in 5. The temperature gauge climbed into the red zone, stayed there somehow, didn't explode. By the time she reached the field hospital, the engine was making sounds that would have made a mechanic weep, but she made it. The motor pool sergeant, a grizzled man named Kowalski, who claimed he'd helped build the first Jeep grills back in Toledo, examined the damage and whistled. "Ma'am, you should be walking back. This radiator's shot to hell." "But I'm not walking back," Morrison pointed out. "I'm here." Kowalski tapped the grill with one scarred knuckle. "This thing saved you. Most of the cooling air was still getting through. Ugly design, but it works." "Why 9 slots?" Morrison asked, suddenly curious. "Why not more or fewer?" Kowalski shrugged. Someone back in Detroit decided 9 was the right number, someone who probably never saw a desert or a German bullet. But whoever it was, they knew what they were doing. Morrison touched the grill, feeling the bullet lodge in the stamped steel. "Do you know who designed it?" "Nope, just know it works. That's all that matters out here." Morrison went back to her patients, men with wounds far worse than a damaged radiator, men who needed her more than her curiosity needed answers. But sometimes during the brief moments between crises, she'd look at the Jeeps parked outside the hospital tent and think about the person who designed those 9 slots. She never learned his name, but she lived through the war partly because of his work, and that seemed like enough. Burma, February 1945. Lieutenant James Tanaka had more reasons than most to hate the Japanese Empire. His parents were in Manzanar, an internment camp in California, imprisoned by their own government because of their ancestry. Tanaka could have joined them, could have refused to serve, could have protested the injustice. Instead, he'd volunteered for the most dangerous duty he could find. Intelligence work behind enemy lines in Burma. He wanted to prove something, loyalty maybe, or anger, or just that he was more American than the people who'd locked up his parents. Now he was deep in Japanese-controlled territory with a three-man team gathering intelligence on troop movements, calling in airstrikes, living on adrenaline and hatred. They moved at night, hid during the day, and relied on a single Jeep that they'd somehow kept running for 6 weeks through jungle that destroyed everything. The Jeep's grille was caked with mud, dented from a dozen close calls but still functional. 9 slots, mostly clear, allowing just enough airflow to keep the engine from seizing in the tropical heat. Tanaka cleaned that grille religiously, not because he cared about the Jeep's appearance, but because a failed radiator meant death. On their 42nd night behind enemy lines, they ran into a Japanese patrol. The firefight was brief and brutal. Tanaka's radio man died in the first 30 seconds. His translator took a round in the leg. Tanaka himself killed 3 enemy soldiers at point-blank range before they could regroup and get to the Jeep. They drove through the darkness with only the moon for light, the wounded translator bleeding in the back seat, Japanese patrol somewhere behind them. The Jeep's engine was overheating. Too much strain, too much load, too much everything. The temperature gauge was buried past the red line, but they kept moving. Tanaka watched that grille in the moonlight. 9 slots, half blocked with mud, but still channeling air, still cooling the engine just enough to keep it from catastrophic failure. He thought about whoever had designed it, about whether they'd imagined their work being used like this in a jungle half a world away, keeping a Japanese-American soldier alive while he fought against Japan. They made it to Allied lines 3 hours before dawn. The translator survived. The Jeep's engine seized up 10 minutes after they crossed the perimeter, the radiator finally giving out after holding together far longer than it should have. Tanaka stood next to the dead Jeep, looking at that grille one last time. 9 slots. Stamped steel. Ugly. Functional. American. He never learned who designed it. Never knew about Frank Kozlowski or the factory floor decision that had led to stamped grilles replacing welded ones. But years later, after the war, after his parents were released from Manzanar, after he'd spent decades trying to reconcile his service with his family's imprisonment, Tanaka would see those 9 slots and remember Burma. Remember survival. Remember that sometimes the ugliest things are the most beautiful. Berlin, Germany, May 1945. Corporal Marcus Washington had grown up in Alabama, where separate but equal meant separate and unequal in every way that mattered. He'd joined the Army because it was better than sharecropping, only to discover that the Army had its own forms of segregation. Black soldiers fought in black units, commanded mostly by white officers, given the dangerous work that white units didn't want. Washington's transportation company had fought its way across France and into Germany, driving trucks and jeeps through combat zones, keeping supply lines open under fire. They'd done their job well enough that even the IA, white officers had to acknowledge it, though acknowledgement didn't mean respect. Now, in the ruins of Berlin, Washington was driving a jeep through streets that looked like the end of the world. Buildings reduced to rubble, German civilians staring with hollow eyes, Soviet soldiers on one side of the city, Americans and British on the other, everyone waiting to see if the alliance would hold or if they'd start fighting each other next. Washington's Jeep was ancient by military standards, built in 1942, 3 years of hard use held together by repairs and stubbornness, but it still ran. That grille, dented and scarred and stained with 3 years' worth of European mud, still did its job. Think they'll scrap these after the war? His passenger, another black soldier named Johnson, asked. Probably. Military doesn't keep old equipment. Shame. This Jeep's been more reliable than most people I know. Washington looked at the grill. You ever think about who designed these things? Who decided what they'd look like? Some white guy in Detroit, probably. Why? Just wondering if he knew, if whoever designed this grill knew it'd end up here, in Berlin, driven by a black soldier from Alabama, helping win a war against a regime that thought we were subhuman. Johnson was quiet for a moment. That's some heavy thinking, Marcus. Yeah, well, this is a heavy place. They drove through the ruins in silence, past German prisoners being marched to camps, past displaced persons trying to find their families, past the physical evidence of a regime that had tried to conquer the world and failed. Washington never learned who designed the grille, never knew about the ex-sergeant who'd sketched it at a kitchen table, or the politics of replacing welded grills with stamped ones, or the 12 Toledo welders who'd signed their names on the last handcrafted grill. But decades later, when Washington was an old man watching the civil rights movement on television, watching black Americans demand the equality that had been promised but never delivered, he'd think about that Jeep in Berlin, about driving through the ruins of a racist empire in a vehicle designed by someone who probably never imagined a black soldier behind the wheel. The grill hadn't cared what color he was. It had just kept working, cooling the engine, doing its job. Maybe Washington thought that was the best you could hope for from inanimate objects. They didn't have prejudices. They just worked or they didn't. The 9 slots had worked. That was enough. Dearborn, Michigan, May 8, 1945. Frank Kozlowski heard about Germany's surrender on the radio while working late at the Rouge. The factory floor erupted in cheers, men and women throwing their caps in the air, hugging each other, crying with relief. The European war was over. Half the war was done. Frank stood at the stamping press station watching Ruth and her crew celebrate. They'd been stamping grills for 3.5 years now, hundreds of thousands of them, maybe more than 1 million. Frank had lost count of the exact numbers somewhere around mid-1943. Ruth saw him standing there and came over, her face flushed with excitement. "We did it, Frank. We won." "Half won," Frank corrected gently. "Still got Japan. But Europe's done. Hitler's dead. The Nazis are finished." She gestured at the press behind her. "And these grills, our grills, were on every Jeep that helped make it happen." Frank thought about that. About Jeeps he'd never seen, and places he'd never been, driven by men and women whose names he'd never know, but all of them with 9-slot grills protecting their radiators. "How many do you think we made?" Ruth asked. "Total, all the plants combined?" Frank did rough math in his head. Ford's 6 plants plus Willys' Toledo operation running for 3.5 years at increasing capacity, probably north of 600,000, maybe more. 600,000. Ruth tested the number. That's 600,000 Jeeps. That needed grills, yeah. Your design, Frank, every single one. Not mine, ours. Everyone's, Ford's, Willys', the Army's. Belongs to whoever needed them. Ruth looked at him with an expression that was half admiration, half exasperation. "You really don't care about credit, do you?" Frank thought about Private Torres on Omaha Beach, though he'd never know Torres's name, about Sergeant Chen in Guadalcanal, about Captain Morrison in North Africa, about Lieutenant Tanaka in Burma, about Corporal Washington in Berlin, about thousands of others whose stories would never be told, but who'd relied on 9 ugly slots to keep their engines cool. "I care about one thing," Frank said, repeating what he'd told Catherine Morse 3 years ago in Toledo. "Those grills working when someone needs their Jeep to start. That's all that matters." "That's all that matters," Ruth echoed softly. Then she smiled. "You're going to say that at your funeral, aren't you? Here lies Frank Kozlowski. All that mattered was that the grills worked." Frank smiled back. "Could do worse for an epitaph." The celebration continued around them. The war in Europe was over, and people who'd been working killing hours for years were finally allowing themselves to believe that survival might be possible. But Frank knew the other half was still coming. Japan hadn't surrendered. The Pacific War was still raging. The grills would keep being needed. Che-chunk. Even during the celebration, the press kept running. Night shift had work to do. Jeeps to supply. Grills to stamp. Ruth returned to her station, and Frank walked the factory floor one more time, past the assembly lines and stamping stations and inspection areas. The Rouge had produced over 280,000 Jeeps during the war. Other Ford plants had produced more. Willys had produced even more than that. And every single one had 9 slots in its grill. Ugly slots, simple slots. Slots that had taken 8 seconds to stamp instead of 43 minutes to weld. Slots that had saved lives. Frank would never know how many. Would never hear Torres's story, or Chen's story, or Morrison's story, or Tanaka's story, or Washington's story, or the thousands of others who'd survived partly because a grill kept working when everything else was falling apart. He wouldn't know that his design would outlive him, that 70 years later, people would still recognize those 9 slots, modified to 7 for trademark purposes, adapted for civilian use, stylized in 100 different ways, but still fundamentally his concept. Still the ugly solution to a production problem that had somehow become iconic. All Frank knew, standing on the factory floor in May 1945, was that the grills had worked, and that was enough. Dearborn, Michigan, August 15, 1945. The announcement came over the radio at 7:00 p.m. Eastern Time. Japan had surrendered. The war, the entire war, was over. Frank Kozlowski stood in his kitchen, the same kitchen where he'd sketched the 9-slot grill nearly 4 years earlier, and listened to President Truman's voice crackle through the speaker. Margaret was beside him, her hand finding his, squeezing gently. They'd both been through one world war already. Now they'd survived a second. Outside, the neighborhood erupted. People poured into the streets, shouting, crying, embracing strangers. Church bells rang. Car horns honked. Someone set off fireworks left over from the 4th of July. The noise was deafening, joyful, cathartic. Frank and Margaret stayed inside, holding hands in their quiet kitchen, listening to the celebration through the walls. "It's over," Margaret said softly. "Yeah." Frank looked at the kitchen table, remembering the October night in 1941 when he'd sat there sketching, remembering the simplicity of the problem. How do you make a grill faster? The solution had been ugly, but it had worked. "What happens now?" Margaret asked. "To the factory, to your job?" "Production will shift. Civilian vehicles. They'll still need grills, just not at wartime scale." Frank considered that. "Might go back to the line. Being a supervisor was temporary anyway." "You don't want to stay in engineering?" "I'm not an engineer, Maggie. I'm a factory man who had one good idea." Margaret looked at him with that expression she'd had since France in 1918, the one that said she saw through his modesty to the truth underneath. "One good idea that probably saved thousands of lives? Maybe, but it was still just an idea. Other people made it real." The celebration outside grew louder. Someone was playing music, Glenn Miller appropriately enough. In the mood, the sound of a country that had held its breath for 4 years and was finally exhaling. Frank thought about all the grills he'd never seen, the ones on Omaha Beach and Guadalcanal and North Africa and Burma and Berlin, the ones that had kept engines running through conditions that should have destroyed them, the ugly, simple, functional 9-slot designs that had become the face of American military mobility. "Will they give you credit?" Margaret asked. "For the design? Some kind of recognition?" "Don't need it." "That's not what I asked." Frank smiled slightly. "No, they won't. It's just a military specification now. Design belongs to the government, which is fine. Credit doesn't matter." "It matters to me," Margaret said quietly. "You should be recognized." "I was recognized. Sheldrick promoted me, gave me authority to fix problems across 6 plants. That's recognition enough." But even as he said it, Frank wondered about the future, about whether anyone would remember in 10 years or 20 or 50 who had designed the stamped grill, whether the history books would record the welders in Toledo or the presses at the Rouge, or the ex-sergeant who'd watched a stopwatch and done simple math. Probably not. History remembered generals and presidents. It remembered battles and treaties. It rarely remembered the anonymous engineers who made the weapons work. And that was okay, because the work had mattered more than the recognition. Dearborn, Michigan, 1946-1955. The post-war years were strange. The Rouge slowly converted back to civilian production, cars instead of jeeps, peacetime efficiency instead of wartime urgency. Frank returned to line supervision, overseeing stamping operations, training new workers to replace the veterans who were going home or moving to other jobs. The grill design continued. Willys-Overland, sensing opportunity, launched a civilian version of the MB, the CJ, civilian Jeep. But there was a problem. The 9-slot grill was too similar to the military design. For trademark purposes, Willys needed something distinctive. They reduced it to 7 slots. Frank learned about this from Ruth, who'd seen the new civilian models in a dealership window. "Your 9 slots became 7, she said, showing him a photograph from a magazine advertisement. Frank studied the image. The 7-slot grille was obviously derived from his design. Same concept, same stamped construction, just fewer openings. Makes sense. Easier to trademark a unique number. Doesn't that bother you? They took your design and modified it just enough to claim it as theirs. It's not my design anymore. It was just an idea. They made it commercial. Frank, Ruth looked at him seriously. You do realize that grille, 7 slots or 9, is going to be everywhere now. It's not just a military vehicle anymore. It's going to be part of American culture. She was right. By 1950, the Jeep CJ was a common sight on farms, ranches, and rural roads across America. The 7-slot grille became synonymous with the brand, and while most people knew vaguely that the design came from World War II, few knew any specifics about who'd created it or why. Frank watched the phenomenon from a distance with a mix of pride and bemusement. His ugly solution to a wartime production problem had become an American icon. Children drew Jeeps with 7 slots. Toy manufacturers stamped miniature versions. Hollywood put them in movies, war films, westerns, adventure stories. The grille had transcended its original purpose and become pure symbol. In 1952, a young journalist from the Detroit Free Press came to the Rouge doing a story on wartime production. He'd heard rumors about the grille design and was trying to track down the original designer. Frank Kozlowski, the journalist said, finding Frank on the factory floor. I'm told you might have information about the stamped grille design. Might, Frank agreed. What do you want to know? Who designed it? The Army records just say Ford Motor Company. But someone specific must have come up with it. Frank thought about how to answer that. The truth was complicated. He'd sketched the concept, but Ford's engineers had made it work, and Willys had adapted it, and the Army had standardized it. Whose design was it, really? It was a team effort, Frank said finally. A lot of people contributed, but someone had the original idea. Someone drew the first sketch. Ideas are cheap. Implementation is what matters. The journalist persisted for 20 minutes, trying to get Frank to claim credit, but Frank deflected every question, redirecting to the engineers, the die makers, the press operators. Finally, frustrated, the journalist gave up. The article that ran the following week mentioned Ford's contribution to Jeep production, but didn't name Frank. It described the stamped grille as an elegant engineering solution, which would have made Frank laugh if he'd bothered to read it. Elegant, his ugly grille. Dearborn, Michigan, 1956-1967. Frank retired from Ford in 1956 at age 60. He'd spent 37 years at the Rouge, from line worker to supervisor to wartime consultant and back to supervisor. The retirement party was small, a few dozen people from his department, a plaque thanking him for his service, a modest pension that would keep him and Margaret comfortable. No one mentioned the grille. Frank was fine with that. Retirement suited him. He tended a small garden, read history books, spent time with grandchildren who'd been born after the war and had no memory of the urgency that had driven their grandfather's work. Sometimes he'd see a Jeep, civilian version, 7 slots, and think about Toledo and Ruth and the CHA chunk of stamping presses. But mostly he just lived quietly, a man whose contribution to history was invisible. In 1960, Margaret got sick. Cancer, the doctor said. They gave her 6 months. She lived for 14, fighting every day with the same determination she'd shown as a nurse in France 40 years earlier. Frank sat with her every evening, reading aloud from books she'd always loved, holding her hand as she grew weaker. Near the end, when the pain was bad and the morphine made her drift, she said something that surprised him. You should tell someone about the grille before it's too late. It's not important, Maggie. It's your legacy. You saved lives with that design. Maybe, but whose lives? I don't know their names. Don't know their stories. How do you claim credit for saving people you'll never meet? Margaret squeezed his hand with what little strength she had left. You don't claim credit. You just acknowledge it happened, that you were part of something important. I acknowledge it. Every time I see those 7 slots, I know where they came from. That's enough. For you, maybe, but what about history? Shouldn't someone know? Frank thought about that, about the journalist who tried to get him to talk in 1952. about the official Army records that listed only Ford Motor Company, about the complete absence of his name from any historical documentation of the Jeep's development. "History doesn't need my name," he said gently. "It just needs to remember that the grille worked, that American production capacity won the war. Whether I get credit is irrelevant." Margaret died 3 days later. Frank buried her next to the plot he'd already purchased for himself, in a cemetery on the outskirts of Dearborn, where factory workers and executives lay side by side in democratic death. After the funeral, Frank's daughter, a schoolteacher named Sarah, who'd inherited her mother's sharp intelligence, asked about the war years. "Mom said you designed something important, something that saved lives." Frank was sorting through Margaret's belongings, packing away 43 years of marriage into boxes that would go to children and grandchildren. He found an old photograph of himself in 1942 standing next to a Jeep with a 9-slot grille, looking younger and more certain than he remembered being. "I sketched a grille," he said simply. "Made it faster to produce, that's all." "That's not what Mom said. She said you were too modest about it." "Your mother was generous." Sarah looked at the photograph, then at her father. "Why won't you talk about it? You're proud of it, I can tell. But you act like it doesn't matter." Frank set down the box he was packing and sat in the chair that had been Margaret's favorite. How to explain it? How to make her understand that the work had mattered precisely because he didn't matter? "During the war," he said slowly, "I visited 6 Ford plants, trained people, fixed problems, made sure the grills were being stamped correctly. And at every plant, I met people who were doing important work. Die makers, press operators, quality inspectors, people who'd never get their names in the paper, never get recognition, but whose work was absolutely essential." He paused, remembering Ruth at her press, Thompson fixing the wobble in Louisville, Silva correcting the dies in Richmond. "If I claimed credit for the grill," Frank continued, "it would diminish what they did. It would make it seem like one man's idea mattered more than everyone's execution, and that's not true. The idea was simple, making it work, making 600,000 grills that functioned correctly under combat conditions. That was the hard part. But you started it. Without your idea, without my idea, someone else would have thought of stamping. It was obvious once you looked at the production numbers. I just happened to be the one who sketched it first." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "You really believe that? That you were just lucky to think of it first?" "I believe," Frank said carefully, "that in war the right solutions emerge because they have to. If I hadn't designed a stamped grill, someone else would have. The need existed. Someone was going to fill it." "But it was you." "This time, yes. But next time it'll be someone else, some other anonymous engineer solving some other production problem. That's how progress works. Not through individual genius, but through collective necessity." Sarah didn't look convinced, but she dropped the subject. After she left, Frank sat alone in the quiet house, holding the 1942 photograph, thinking about the 9 slots that had become 7 slots that had become an American icon. In 1965, while watching television news coverage of the Vietnam War, Frank saw a Jeep in the background of a combat report. It was a newer model, upgraded, modernized, different in 100 small ways from the 1942 MB. But the grille was unmistakable, 7 slots now, but still clearly derived from his 9-slot design. 23 years after he'd sketched it, the grille was still saving lives. Frank never told anyone that he was watching his own legacy drive past in the background of a war he didn't understand, in a country he'd never visited, saving soldiers who'd been born after his design was created. He just watched in silence and thought about Margaret and acknowledged privately that maybe, just maybe, he'd contributed something that mattered. Dearborn, Michigan, November 1967. Frank Kozlowski died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after his 71st birthday. He'd been working in his garden, tending the tomatoes that wouldn't survive the coming winter. The neighbor found him collapsed among the plants, trowel still in his hand. The funeral was small. His children and grandchildren, a few old friends from Ford, some neighbors. The obituary in the Detroit Free Press was 3 sentences long. Frank Kozlowski, 71, retired Ford Motor Company supervisor, died November the 7th, survived by 2 children and 5 grandchildren. Services at Woodlawn Cemetery Thursday, 2nd p.m. No mention of Jeeps, no mention of grills, no mention of the stamped steel design that had helped win World War II, and then become one of the most recognizable automotive features in American history. Sarah stood at the gravesite watching her father's casket being lowered into the ground next to her mother's and felt a surge of frustration. He should be remembered, she thought. Someone should know what he did. But who would she tell? Who would care about a production decision made 26 years ago? Who would believe that this quiet man, this factory supervisor who'd never sought recognition, had designed something that millions of people saw every day without realizing it? After the funeral, while sorting through Frank's papers, Sarah found a folder labeled 1941-1942 work documents. Inside were production reports, technical drawings, correspondence with other Ford plants, and at the bottom, carefully preserved, was a simple pencil sketch on yellowed paper. 9 vertical slots, rough dimensions, a note in her father's handwriting. Stamping time, est, 5/8 seconds. No welding, no assembly. And a date, October the 18th, 1941. Sarah stared at the sketch for a long time. This was it. This was the original. The idea that had become a military specification, that had become a civilian trademark, that had become an American icon. Her father's handwriting, her father's design, and absolutely no way to prove that to anyone who mattered. She could take it to Ford, could try to get some kind of historical recognition, but Frank had spent decades deflecting credit. Honor in his memory meant respect in his choice, didn't it? Sarah put the sketch back in the folder and filed it away with the other papers. Maybe someday, she thought, someone would care enough to research the history properly, to track down the actual designer instead of just attributing it to Ford Motor Company, but probably not. History remembered the visible things, the generals and presidents, the battles and treaties. It rarely remembered the anonymous engineers whose work made everything else possible. Epilogue. The icon lives on. By 1970, the Jeep brand had passed through multiple corporate owners, but the 7-slot grille remained constant. It was trademarked, protected, essential to the brand identity. Every Jeep model, civilian, military, commercial, featured those distinctive vertical slots. In design schools, students learned about the Jeep grille as an example of functional design becoming iconic, but none of the textbooks mentioned Frank Kozlowski. Most attributed the design to Willys-Overland, since they held the trademark. Some mentioned Ford's contribution, but only in vague terms. The Toledo welders who'd built the last handcrafted grills were forgotten. The die makers who'd perfected the stamping process were forgotten. Ruth, who'd operated the first production press, was forgotten. Frank, who'd sketched the original design, was forgotten. Only the grille remained. 9 slots reduced to 7, stamped steel, refined and modernized, but still fundamentally the same concept that Frank had drawn at his kitchen table in October 1941. Ugly, simple, fast, perfect. The soldiers who'd driven Jeeps through World War II, the ones who survived, aged, and died. Danny Torres from Omaha Beach, Michael Chen from Guadalcanal, Elizabeth Morrison from North Africa, James Tanaka from Burma, Marcus Washington from Berlin. All of them went to their graves, never knowing who designed the 9 slots that had protected their radiators and, indirectly, their lives. The Jeeps themselves became collector's items. Restored MB and GPW models sold for thousands of dollars, prized for their historical authenticity. Collectors argued endlessly about correct paint colors, proper markings, original parts. But no one argued about the grille. Everyone agreed on the 9 slots. Stamped steel, simple design, iconic appearance. No one knew who designed it. By 2020, the Jeep grille had been in continuous use for 78 years. It had survived corporate mergers, design trends, technological changes, and shifting consumer tastes. The basic 7-slot configuration remained, trademarked, protected, instantly recognizable worldwide. It was on Wranglers and Cherokees and Gladiators. It was on toys and T-shirts and logo designs. It was one of the most recognized automotive features in existence, seen by millions of people every day. and not one person in a million knew that it had started with an ex-sergeant named Frank Kozlowski sitting at a kitchen table in Dearborn, Michigan, with a pencil and a simple question: how do you make a grill faster? The answer had been ugly, but it had worked, and in the end, that was all that mattered. Somewhere in the Ford archives, if anyone cared to look, there was a file from 1941 containing production reports, technical drawings, and engineering specifications. Buried in that file was a memo from Lawrence Sheldrick recommending the adoption of a stamped grill designed for military Jeep production. The memo mentioned suggestions from factory floor supervisors, but didn't name Frank specifically. That was fine. Frank wouldn't have wanted to be named anyway. The work had mattered more than the recognition. The grill had mattered more than the designer. And the soldiers who'd come home alive, who'd driven Jeeps with 9-slot grills through hell and survived, they'd mattered most of all. Frank Kozlowski designed the face of American military mobility in World War II. He saved thousands of lives with 8 seconds of stamping time and 9 simple slots in a piece of steel. He changed automotive history and created one of the most enduring design icons of the 20th century. And he died with a 3-sentence obituary that didn't mention any of it, because that was the nature of anonymous genius. The work lived on, the workers faded away. The grill remained. The man who designed it was forgotten. But on quiet mornings, when the sun hits a Jeep grill at just the right angle, when those 7 slots or 9 on the vintage models cast shadows that look almost intentional, almost meaningful, in those moments, maybe Frank's ghost smiles, not because anyone remembers his name, because somewhere in the world another Jeep is starting, another radiator's being cooled, another engine is running, because 8 seconds of stamping time 79 years ago made it possible. The ugly design still works, and that's all that matters.